Imagine finally getting the dream job, buying the perfect house, or hitting that massive milestone you've been working toward for years, and then realizing you're still not actually happy. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going to dive deep into why the finish line of success often feels surprisingly empty, and more importantly, how we can consciously design a life of actual meaning. We're unpacking some fascinating insights from a few brilliant thinkers to figure out why we all keep falling into the exact same traps.
Seriously, think about it for a second. What's one achievement you are absolutely sure would change everything for you? You get the big promotion, right? And for a few days, you're on top of the world. But then you wake up a few weeks later and realize you're still exactly the same person. The scenery changed, sure, but your baseline level of happiness, it didn't budge. It's a remarkably universal experience, and honestly, it points to a massive flaw in how we're all taught to think about achievement.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, the happiness illusion, and a little something called the hedonic treadmill.
Author Scott Galloway hits on this perfectly in his book, The Algebra of Wealth. He explains exactly why chasing that next external milestone literally never permanently elevates our mood. See, when you get a raise, it feels incredible at first. But human beings are incredibly adaptable. Very quickly, your expectations shift. That new, higher salary just becomes your new normal, and suddenly, you're back to craving the next bump just to feel that exact same high. You're running on a treadmill. You're burning all this energy, but psychologically, you're staying in the exact same spot.
And the research on this is just wild. It suggests that genetics predetermine up to 50% of our baseline happiness level. We all know people who are just naturally buoyant and joyful, and others who naturally trend a bit more cynical or pessimistic. But here's the incredibly empowering part. That leaves the other 50% entirely up to how we construct our lives. It's not just about the circumstances or the luck you're handed, it's about what you actively choose to build.
Which brings us to Section 2, the default path, or basically, society's script. In his book, The Pathless Path, Paul Miller draws this brilliant contrast between two very different ways of living. He shows how relying on external cues pretty much forces us to just fit in. The default path is all about chasing prestige and climbing the corporate ladder. It's about seeking validation from the inner ring of whatever industry you happen to be in. But the pathless path, that requires self-authoring. It relies heavily on your unique interests and your own intrinsic motivation. It's about actually writing your own story, rather than just blindly reading from society's script.
Millard has this great quote where he points out that following everyone else might feel incredibly safe, but it almost always distances you from what actually makes you feel alive. Those fixed points, graduating, getting a corporate job, buying a house in the suburbs, they aren't inherently evil, but they act like this powerful ocean current, sweeping you along to just do what everyone else is doing, rather than giving you a moment to stop and ask, wait, what do I actually want to do?
And that naturally leads into Section 3, the trap of false purpose, and our endless chase for validation.
Robert Greene warns us about this in The Laws of Human Nature. He argues that chasing external metrics just leaves us alienated and completely exhausted. Think about it. We've democratized attention through social media, meaning literally anyone can now chase the kind of massive applause that used to be reserved for kings and celebrities. But when you tie your self-image to daily validation from strangers, you become desperately anxious the second that attention ebbs. It forces people to become more and more outrageous, basically turning you into a clown rather than a real creator.
Greene actually brings up this chilling quote from Nietzsche to explain modern cynicism. People would literally rather chase a hollow, soulless void, like endless social media clout or purely material wealth, than face the sheer existential terror of having no direction at all. We cling so tightly to a false purpose, simply because it's so much easier than doing the really hard, quiet work of defining a real one.
And this sets up a wild psychological paradox known as hyperintention. Have you ever desperately needed to fall asleep, and because you're trying so hard, you just can't? Or you desperately try to be charming on a date, and you end up being incredibly awkward? Well, the exact same thing goes for money and success. If you desperately chase status and happiness, you almost always wind up miserable. As Greene notes, the most wildly successful people usually don't start out with an obsession for money. They start with a deep obsession for creating something genuinely great.
So how do we fix this? Let's get into Section 4, the concept of enough and how we redefine ambition.
Going back to Scott Galloway for a second, he points out that the hedonic treadmill doesn't actually have to be a trap, provided you redefine what you're working toward. Look, you can't step off the treadmill completely. We're human. But once you understand how it works, you can absolutely stop being a slave to it. And you do this by building a foundational framework for actual security and personal sovereignty, rather than just chasing endless, exhausting extravagance.
By securing a few practical pillars, you can stop trading your time just for mere survival. You build an emergency fund so you aren't constantly operating out of fear. You form a kitchen cabinet, a tight core group of pragmatic friends who actually hold you accountable. You actively cultivate hobbies that have absolutely nothing to do with your career or making money. And you let time compound your efforts. This is the real core of what Galloway calls the algebra of wealth.
I absolutely love this quote from him. It's such a beautiful reminder that external success is just a tool. It's not the meaning of the book itself. Money gives you options, for sure. It gives you freedom from everyday anxiety. But if you don't know what you want the story of your life to actually be about, all the ink in the world isn't going to help you write it.
All right, Section 5, Picking Your Own Path, and Why It's Time to Stop Waiting for Permission.
Seth Godin has this brilliant perspective on this. He points out that hiding behind the excuse that you haven't been chosen yet is a massive trap. The dominant system wants you to wait. Wait for a publisher to pick your book. Wait for a boss to give you that promotion. Wait for an algorithm to magically bless your content. It is a wonderfully safe place to hide, because as long as you're waiting, you never actually have to face the resistance of putting your real work into the world and saying, "Here, I made this."
So, practically speaking, how do we step off that default script? Paul Millard suggests a few really concrete steps. First, don't just blindly quit your job. Prototype your leap in small, manageable ways. Tame your fears by writing down and clearly defining what the actual worst-case scenario is. It's usually not as bad as you think. Most importantly, find the others. Venture out of your bubble and go make friends who are already living on an interesting, pathless path. And finally, look backwards. What did you intrinsically love doing as a kid, long before the world told you what you should care about?
And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, Redefining Success and Figuring Out What It Really Means to Win at Life.
Harvard psychologist Robert Greene talks about how we're shifting into an era where just fitting in is no longer enough to survive mentally. We have to develop the skill of self-authoring. This is honestly the ultimate antidote to the hedonic treadmill. When you anchor your self-worth in a coherent story that you wrote yourself, based entirely on your own intrinsic values, society's superficial metrics totally lose their power over you.
Robert Greene adds that to avoid burnout on this path, you have to engineer what he calls peak experiences. You do this by taking your massive, overwhelming ambitions and breaking them down into a ladder of descending, highly manageable micro-goals. When you do that, you can actually lose yourself entirely in the daily work. You start hitting these incredible states of flow where your ego just disappears. You embrace being genuinely useful as its own profound reward, and that creates a calmness and a joy that makes the pursuit of fame and money look incredibly cheap by comparison.
But here is the absolute craziest part of all of this. We already know this. We really do. A Gallup poll cited by Paul Millard reveals that 97% of people say true success is following your interests to become your best self. Yet 92% of those exact same people believe that society defines success merely as being rich and famous. We all secretly know what true success actually looks like, and yet we continuously, willingly fall into the trap of performing for society's false metrics. To break that cycle once and for all, Seth Godin has this amazing challenge. He says we need to ask two simple questions of every single project, career move, or pursuit. Who is it for, and what is it for? If you're just doing it so some vague group of people on the internet will applaud you, you're hiding. But if you know exactly who you are trying to serve and exactly what change you are trying to make in their lives, you've found your true compass.
I want to leave you with this final thought. Success, the money, the stability, the recognition, it can absolutely improve the conditions of your life, but only meaning can give it direction. Getting what you want is great, but taking the time to consciously decide what is actually worth wanting, that's the only real path to fulfillment. So who's going to author your next chapter? Society or you? Ask yourself, what is one achievement you thought would change your life, but didn't? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to pick up the pen and start writing that next chapter today.